Hi there. So for my final World Extreme Medicine project, I wanted to talk about the principle of neutrality for humanitarian organizations. So neutrality is one of the humanitarian principles originally defined by the ICRC over 150 years ago, and is understood to mean that humanitarian actors must not take sides in hostilities or engage in controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature, and is regarded as a tool to support the humanitarian principles of humanity and impartiality. But over the past few years, increasing numbers of humanitarians have challenged its unquestioned use. So in this video, I'm going to look more closely at the issues around neutrality for humanitarian organisations, and I'm going to focus on a couple of examples of where the adherence to this principle has been challenged. I'm going to start by looking at the role that humanitarian organisations played in the Rwandan genocide that took place in 1994.
This was the Rwanda genocide. April 1994. Plane carrying the Rwandan president and his Burundian counterpart is shot down. Both are killed. Ethnic tensions are quickly ignited. The Tutsi population is targeted along with moderate Hutus. Hundreds of thousands die. Millions are displaced. The international community is criticized for its response as the killing spread, but of an already small UN force drawn from Rwanda. By July, the Tutsi-led RPF takes control of the country and Hutu militias flee to the DRC. The killings stop and the search for justice begins.
So immediately after the Hutu president's plane is shot down, Hutu extremists in the Rwandan government unleash a campaign that leaves up to 1 million dead in only 100 days. The army, militia, and civilians targeted the country's ethnic Tutsi minority, as well as moderates from the Hutu majority. The Tutsi-dominated rebel army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which had been at war with the regime since 1990, marched on Kigali. Shortly after that, 10 Belgian peacekeepers are mutilated and killed, and the UN scaled down the peacekeeping numbers, withdrawing all but 270 of its 2,500 peacekeepers for security reasons. By July, the RPF has succeeded in defeating the government forces and takes power. Fleeing the advancing rebels and fearful of reprisals, killers and their families were among over 2 million Hutu refugees who fled from Rwanda. About 800,000 arrived in the Zairian city of Goma in muddy and insanitary conditions that triggered a deadly cholera outbreak. The green arrows show how the Hutus escaped from Rwanda. Other Hutus, internally displaced people, took refuge inside Rwanda in a zone that was named Operation Turquoise here, where a French intervention force was stationed. Now, France had been actually aligned with the Hutu regime that had planned the genocide. And part of the remit of the intervention force was to prevent the Tutsi-led RPF from taking over the whole country. So the frenzy of media attention on the disaster led to dozens of aid groups rushing to help, and this certainly did save lives. But the killers and members of the former army units were not weeded out. The camps to which most of the displaced had fled were predominantly under the control of the forces of the former Hutu regime, which had been responsible for the genocide. Indeed, whilst conducting a vaccination drive, one aid worker in Goma, who was working for MSF, a Briton called Catherine Conlon, remembers well-built guys at the front of the queue in uniform, carrying fat kids, and she remembered thinking, hang on a minute, what? During the first 3 months of the genocide, only a handful of international aid groups had found it possible to work inside Rwanda. By mid-September 1995, 20 times more aid had gone to refugees outside the country than to support the plan for refugee settlement within Rwanda. Many NGOs did choose to work in the camps for the internally displaced, mostly Hutu people, under the protection of the French intervention force. Indeed, the European Community Humanitarian Office practically obliged NGOs it was funding to establish operations in the safe French zone. So, in a number of ways, NGOs, as well as official donors, such as the UN agencies, inadvertently had assisted the perpetrators of the genocide, especially after they'd fled to neighbouring countries. According to Human Rights Watch Africa, essential services, including food, water, blankets and tents, were pilfered by the ex-government army and militias for use at their own military bases. In at least 2 instances, the ex-government army and militia had kept children, including child soldiers, on its military bases solely to retain access to NGO assistance that otherwise would have been denied. And because of being not willing or able to distinguish between civilian and military recipients, one international NGO continued to provide supplies and medical treatment to 2 explicitly military camps. And too many international NGOs in Goma continued to employ Rwandan individuals strongly suspected of participating in the mass genocide. And so on the back of that, in November 94, MSF France pulled out of the area, and it denounced Western inaction over genocide prosecution and shortcomings of aid-only response to world crisis. The ethics of that decision provoked intense debate. So how did humanitarian communities reflect and change in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide? As well as having been an appalling tragedy for the Rwandan population, the genocide and its aftermath was also a traumatic experience for the humanitarian community. The aid response was found to have been poorly coordinated, politically adrift, and focused on the wrong things. The UN did not act on the warning signs, and after the murder of the Belgian peacekeepers, the UN was largely terrorized into passivity. Instead of scaling up its peacekeeping posture, the Security Council, being unable to stomach the losses, had scaled them down. With a few notable exceptions, international efforts within Rwanda's borders did little to protect civilians from harm during the genocide. Humanitarianism Unbound, the widely cited November 1994 paper by these authors, investigated the genocide for the now defunct human rights advocacy NGO, African Rights, and it argued that Rwanda was an extreme example of the hazards of politically blind humanitarianism, that NGOs had demonstrated cynical defeatism and naivety, and in so doing had fudged the Rwandan genocide. And there were missed opportunities for aid groups to take a moral stand and address fundamental political and human rights concerns. The 1996 Joint Evaluation of Emergency Assistance to Rwanda was an influential evaluation, and the JEAAR Study 3, that was led by John Borton, looked at the international humanitarian component of the response. His conclusions were as follows: that over 200 aid groups had operated without strong coordination and in the absence of a coherent parallel response from political, military and diplomatic players. That the UN had been unwilling to provide security in and around the refugee camps and separate genocidaires from innocent civilians. As a result of this, were forced to choose between providing assistance to all or pulling out altogether, as MSF France had done. It was particularly critical of the coordination arrangements within the UN, the lack of preparation by key agencies ahead of massive refugee influx into Goma in July, and the poor performance of some international NGOs. But there were improvements following the 1996 joint evaluation, and these included the UN's coordination capacity, which has gradually become much stronger, and the study's recommendations on professional standards met with the most success, spurring the beginning of the Sphere standards and its associated initiatives that try to maintain a verifiable level of quality in relief work. So let's now move to the current conflict in Gaza. This is a watershed moment for humanitarian organizations who increasingly are being urged by their staff to take a bolder public stance about the violations of humanitarian law. Employees of international humanitarian organizations, especially local Palestinians, have found themselves as vulnerable as the civilians they are trying to assist. More than 100 UN personnel have been killed in Gaza now since October the 7th, the largest number in any conflict in the organization's history. Many aid workers are accusing their employers of being too muted in their responses, or even of being complicit when they avoid calling out the perpetrators of war crimes. And meanwhile, humanitarian officials are wrestling with how stridently to protest, as they must also work with Israel to negotiate access to hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians in urgent need. Jennifer Leaning, a public health scholar at Harvard who's written extensively about humanitarian responses to conflicts, said, "Humanitarian workers are also de facto diplomats, forced to choose their words carefully to safeguard vital access and funding. But in most other conflicts, civilians have had an escape route, and violations of the norm were more sporadic. But in Gaza, aid groups have witnessed the bombing of a trapped population, as well as attacks on hospitals, medical convoys, schools, and other targets typically considered off limits." Now, the rising anger inside various agencies has been chronicled by the news outlet Devek. For weeks, humanitarian workers at the United Nations Migration Agency, IOM, have detailed their concerns over the Israel-Gaza war in emails, town hall meetings, and an internal letter to their director, demanding a clear public stance against forced displacement of Palestinians. The ICRC, typically among the most measured in its comments, said, "The horrific loss of civilian lives in Israel cannot be used to justify the limitless destruction of Gaza." And in a November statement, the ICRC said, "Israel's attacks on hospitals are becoming unbearable." The WFP World Food Programme chief, Cindy McCain, widow of Republican Senator John McCain, is facing calls for her resignation from staff who circulated a letter saying that she is doing damage to the WFP's reputation as the standard bearer in highlighting the links between conflict and hunger. And when UNICEF's chief, Catherine Russell, visited Gaza last month, beleaguered local staff denounced UNICEF's weak position in the face of what can be called a deliberate and systematic attack on the Palestinian children. And more than 600 workers for US aid, that is tasked with migration assistance, signed a letter urging President Biden to push for an immediate ceasefire, saying that they were alarmed and disheartened at the numerous violations of international law. The letter expressed worries about a mass forced displacement of Palestinians, and concerns were also expressed that the US aid chief Amy Pope's past roles as senior advisor on migration to Biden, Homeland Security advisor during the Obama administration, could render the agency susceptible to White House pressure to guard Israelis' interests. Well, the very possibility of being neutral was thrown into question in the wake of the 9/11 attacks on the US and the war on terror that ensued. The US decree that you are either with us or with the terrorists was strongly felt by field teams as they tried to help Afghans on both sides of the front line and visit suspected Taliban arrested by coalition forces to ensure they were treated humanely. And the negation of a neutral space was felt most sharply a couple of years later when an ICRC water engineer was shot dead whilst carrying out his humanitarian work in Afghanistan, and further amplified by 2 attacks on the ICRC in Baghdad a few months later. After this, the ICRC did still not bow to critics and abandon its attempts to forge a neutral role for all sides. And it earned, if not respect, at least begrudging acceptance that having a neutral intermediary in war has its uses. Hugo Slim, the ethicist and former head of policy at ICRC, said in his 2020 New Humanitarian article, "Neutral humanitarian action is one version of humanitarianism, but not the only version." He pointed out that first, political neutrality is not legally required under international humanitarian law, although the law does require relief to be impartial, to support the greatest human need and not give definitive military advantage to one side. Secondly, relief organisations working in the territory of one party to a conflict do not usually have the time, money and diplomatic networks to engage neutrally across a conflict in the way the ICRC aims to do. A neutral humanitarian, he argues, is not necessarily ethically desirable. The question whether it is right to remain neutral when international humanitarian law is being clearly violated, as it is in Gaza, was addressed recently by Sea Change, which is a social purpose organisation, when they invited humanitarian experts to discuss the topic in a webinar panel discussion that was broadcast in December 2023. And there were 7 key takeaways from this discussion, and all broadly speaking supportive of the abandonment of neutrality by humanitarian organisations in Gaza. First, neutrality is a choice, not a sacred principle. Choosing neutrality needed to be based on an analysis of each context. And in the current conflict in Gaza, there's no respect for international humanitarian law. So, they said, it should be imperative for organisations to call out these violations. Local actors often have no voice when it comes to decisions about neutrality, they said. Local staff and partner organisations of international aid groups often face pressure to avoid political engagement and speaking out, especially if they want to access funding. This reflects ongoing colonial attitudes not only about funding, but that also presumes that local actors don't fully understand or are unable to practice neutrality. The third point was, we need solidarity with humanitarian resistance. Increasingly, we see community-led organisations that provide not only humanitarian assistance, but also champion humanitarian resistance. There are risks of abandoning neutrality, it was conceded. Most importantly, there is the risk of losing access to crisis-affected people when an organisation speaks out. It may also endanger the lives of its staff. Less openly discussed is the concern that organisations have that they may lose donors. There are risks of not abandoning neutrality. Neutrality, they argued, can prop up systems of injustice and perpetuate conflict. In Gaza, the occupation has been going on for 75 years, but while remaining neutral has brought some benefits to the population, such as access to prisoners by the ICRC, it has not brought about any long-term positive changes. Indeed, it has been argued that it has prolonged the encampment and siege of the Palestinians. Well, sixth, takeaway message was that speaking out challenges impunity. Speaking out against the genocides in Rwanda and now Palestine, it was said, forces states to assume their duties under the Genocide Convention. Advocacy does not always mean speaking out publicly. Organisations can and do advocate behind closed doors. And finally, a shift is taking place in humanitarian organisations. In recent years, there have been calls for greater diversity, equity and inclusion and the decolonisation of humanitarian organisations. Increasingly, staff are demanding that their leaders speak out against injustices and structural oppression, asking them to put pressure on world leaders to take action instead of purely just asking for funding to respond to crises. In her 2022 article in Humanitarian Law and Policy, Fiona Terry, head of the ICRC Centre for Operational Research and Experience, proffered an opposing and, to my mind, a more compelling view that underpins the commitment of the ICRC to the principle of neutrality. The fundamental premise is that by adopting a neutral posture, avenues are opened to helping victims of conflict. The need to not take sides in hostilities or engage in controversies is there for the simple reason to enjoy the confidence of all. This is not a moral position, she says, but an operational posture that aims to facilitate access to people in distress on both sides of a front line. By being perceived as unbiased, the aim is to gain trust and acceptance so that the organisation is allowed to operate effectively and safely in the territory they control. So the benefits of neutrality are that it facilitates the crossing of front lines to deliver life-saving humanitarian assistance. It facilitates visits to detainees held by both sides and notification of their status to their loved ones. It permits recuperation of the mortal remains of the dead so that they can be returned to their families for a proper burial. It allows for a role in the release or exchange of prisoners or hostages. And rather than imposing silence, it creates the space to discuss with those directly responsible for breaches of international humanitarian law behind closed doors. Actions do not have to be posted on Twitter to actually occur. And consistency is vital in building trust. And neutrality is not the opposite of solidarity, but a way to render this noble sentiment actionable. So in summary, I've listed the benefits as well as challenges of humanitarian neutrality. Benefits being access, safety, being perceived as neutral can enhance, though of course not guarantee, the safety of aid workers, and trust. Challenges include that neutrality may be misinterpreted as moral equivalence between aggressors and victims. Remaining neutral can limit advocacy efforts and addressing root causes of conflict. Violent actors may disregard humanitarian neutrality and target aid workers. So it's got to be a balancing act. Humanitarian organisations must adapt their approach based on the specific context and evolving dynamics. Balancing neutrality with the need to protect civilians requires careful risk management. And neutrality does not preclude advocacy for peace, human rights, and accountability. The evolving landscape of conflict demands nuanced approaches that prioritise both assistance and accountability.